Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. This week is probably one of the most informative conversations that I have ever recorded on how we built the yoga organizations that we have. This conversation from 2024 with Amara Miller is one I constantly send people back to when they ask about how we got the organizations that we have and how we can understand how those yoga organizations work. So take a listen to this revisited conversation, and in July, you're going to hear an updated chat between Amara and myself as we dive into where we are now with our yoga orgs. And of course, like, subscribe, and follow the podcast from wherever you're at. And if you're struggling to set a price for your work, I have a free, and I do mean free, one sheet in our show notes that will help you work this out. Now, let's take a listen to this very informative conversation with Amara Miller. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so I just had to stop talking to my guest so that I could push record and we could start talking again. So welcome Amara Miller to the podcast. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, all. My name is Amara Miller. I am a sociology professor at California State University, East Bay in California, out on the West Coast. And I'm also a practitioner. So as a sociologist, I study of many, many topics, one of which is yoga, and particularly focused on like the history of modern yoga in the United States. And then as a practitioner, I've been a practitioner since I was a teen. So come at it kind of from both angles as a scholar and a practitioner. I'm really excited to talk with you today. Thank you for having me.
I feel like you're going to answer all the questions in my brain. Actually, I know you are because we know each other and I already know what we're going to talk about. I want to talk about the Yoga Alliance because this is in our series on the podcast about yoga teacher training programs. And like sometimes I just look at our teacher training programs and how we're set up and I'm like, what is going on? How did we get here? And truthfully, every conversation I've had has run back to the Yoga Alliance. So you're the expert. So can you just tell us like how the Yoga Alliance formed at the beginning?
Yeah, Yoga Alliance is interesting. I think it's an unavoidable topic now, right? Whenever you talk about certification or teacher training programs, even not just the United States, but like worldwide, like YA comes up. And I think most people don't really know a lot of the history, right? YA is not that old, right? First off. So when we think about like the origins of YA overall, it was founded kind of right around the turn of the century, around 2000, year 2000. But it started out of a kind of hodgepodge group of yoga professionals, so yoga teachers from a bunch of different lineages that in the 1990s, we were coming out of the 1980s. There was a big fitness boom in the 1980s and yoga kind of dovetailed with it, right? Prior to that point, it was much more spiritual practice, much more philosophical practice. And there was some postures, right, asana, that were part of it. But in the 80s, you start to have that shift towards a lot of postural practice, a lot of like power yoga styles, right? And that got exacerbated in the 1990s. And around that time, you start to see the development of teacher training programs just independently, not related to YA. So different traditions, different teachers would kind of start their own teacher training programs. And it was very hodgepodge in the United States and in other countries. Certain teachers had different ways of doing it. So you'd end up with some teachers, for example, who'd offer like these like 1 to 3 months intensives where you would go kind of ashram style. You'd stay there for like a month to 3 months and you train. But increasingly over the 80s and the 90s, what you started to see happen was teachers that didn't come from a specific lineage, who were more Western teachers. And they started offering teacher trainings that were a lot shorter and much more like lots of red flags. So by the like mid 1990s, you started to see some teacher training programs where they were like literally like weekend programs where you would go for a weekend, you'd have 3 days and you'd walk out with like a certification for being a yoga teacher. And so a group of concerned, right, teachers who were involved in a number of organizations started getting together and having conversations about this. And this was really spearheaded by the California Yoga Teachers Association, which was the founding group that started the Yoga Journal, which was not a for-profit magazine at that time. It was like an educational publication put out by CETA. And so the Yoga Journal, right, as kind of part of CYTA, right, this Yoga Teachers Association based in California. And then there were a number of other groups, including some other yoga associations that were kind of from different states, as well as some other kind of just, teacher training, right, program folks who had started teacher trainings in other areas. And so what ended up happening is they started having meetings. So one of the founders of the Yoga Journal and CYTA was Ramajoyiti Vernon, who I don't know if you've heard of. I'm sure you have. Yes, good.
Yes.
Well, not everyone has heard of her. I think a lot of people associate Yoga Journal with Judith Lassiter, which also is fantastic. She's great.
Sure.
But Ramajoyiti Vernon was actually kind of like the founder, and then Judith Lassiter kind of came in, and both of them were involved in this process. But Ramajoyiti Vernon had started a nonprofit prior to this point in like the late 1989 to 1990, right around the fall of the Soviet Union. And this does relate, I know, not tangentially cited. It's called Unity in Yoga. Ramajoyiti Vernon used to teach in the Soviet Union as like a way of spreading yoga around the world. And so Unity in Yoga was kind of like this nonprofit that she had that was oriented around trying to kind of bridge gaps between a lot of traditions that were getting in a lot of like kind of conflicts, very, lightweight conflicts, but conflicts about like, how do you teach? What is yoga, right? What is authentic practice? All this kind of stuff. So Unity in Yoga started, and they started holding conferences. So the first few conferences that were held were actually put on by Unity in Yoga and Ramajoyiti Vernon from about 1989 to about 1994. And then after that point, the California Yoga Teachers Association and Yoga Journal kind of took over planning for those conferences that happened every year. And that's right around the time when the folks who were attending these events were like, we need to talk about certification, because what is going on? We're having 3-day teacher training programs.
Yeah.
There was a lot of concern about a couple things. Like the first was just like, how do you adequately understand yoga in a 3-day training, right? So how do you actually like teach in a way that was going to give teachers like the ability to know what they're teaching? And then there were also a lot of rising concerns about liability issues, because there was increased interest in medical like professions, right, using yoga as kind of a therapeutic practice. But then how do they tell if a teacher's a qualified teacher, right? So, and liability around like injury of students. So these kind of dovetailed concerns about like, how do you make sure a yoga teacher knows enough to actually teach, and also to address liability concerns or injury prevention, kind of sparked a lot of this discussion. So they had a number of like conferences where they had meetings at those conferences talking about it. Initially, what they did was they kind of gathered information about certification systems in other countries. So they did look to the United Kingdom and the British Wheel of Yoga there that had been established much earlier in 1962. And anyway, I won't get into all the details of all these other countries, but they also looked at some other ones in Europe. So the European Yoga Union also was one they looked at, was started in the early 1990s. And they kind of looked at some of like the standards and kind of how those different groups created certification standards. And then in 1997, they had a special meeting, right, conference that was really just dedicated to that formation of standards and discussion around it. And some of those conference attendees then kind of got into touch with each other via email and phone calls, and they formed this group called the Yoga Dialogue. And that included a number of people, some of which folks have probably heard of, like Leslie Kaminoff, as well as some others, Judith Lassiter being a part of that. And then by 1998, They had another conference where Lilias Follon actually was like overseeing, because she was the president of that association at the time that was kind of running the program. And then by March 1998, they adopted that name, the Ad Hoc Yoga Alliance. They talked a little bit about trying to form a nonprofit. And at that point, Ramajyoti Vernon, because she was still someone involved, offered Unity and Yoga as kind of like a shell that they could use, because they'd been kind of defunct. They hadn't really been doing anything for about 5 years. And so Unity and Yoga became the Yoga Alliance in January of 1999. And then by the end of that year, they had kind of created those like 200 to 500, those two different standards, the 200 and 500 hour, and kind of pushed them out. But yeah, it's a very interesting history. There's a lot of different people involved, and it comes from like these different groups that kind of all were working together in these conference spaces. And this is, again, before Yoga Journal kind of sold and became for-profit, right? It was still a nonprofit branch of CETA at that time.
So I want to put some context here because, okay, so they formed in 99. They were creating standards in 99. And one of the things I've said often, and you can tell me if I'm off in my thinking, but like, it seems to me, and this is a conversation I've had with folks like Matthew Taylor, who was like, I did their first website, like all those things, where how could you have imagined how much money was about to flood the industry in the 2000s? And like we couldn't have planned for that. So now here we're in 2024 and we're really like crappy about the Yoga Alliance and what they've done. But the foundation, like nobody knew that Chip was going to come on the scene with his pants to change everything. And so tell me if I'm wrong in that thinking, because we had so much more money flood in when athleisure wear came into play.
No, you're very right. I think the industry developed after the Yoga Alliance was in effect and after these certification standards happened. So like you really didn't see the boom in the industry and like the money like flood into yoga and also co-opt and appropriate yoga, right? In all these really problematic ways, probably until like the later 2000s. And social media, obviously, when it kind of boomed around 2010 and took off after that point, like helped along that process. But at that time, that like turn of the century, right, 1998 to like 2000, which was when they were doing certification kind of standards, and then also when Yoga Alliance was created, I think they really, you know, again, the conversations were really focused on like very real concerns that teachers, longtime teachers had, right, around the quality of instruction. And in particular, this like key question about how do you make sure teachers aren't hurting students, like physically hurting them through like being untrained.
Yeah.
And that was a very real concern, especially with the rise of like power yoga styles, which had like a lot more potential for injury and the integration into medical practices. So I think they saw some of the future right trends around like therapeutic uses of yoga and the integration of yoga into medical industries. Like that was already starting to happen. And those liability concerns were very much informing what they did. But I don't think they had any idea that the industry was going to boom or that yoga was going to become like a fad and so much more popular. I mean, even in the 80s, it was still pretty fringe, even though it was there among the fitness scene. Like it was not the same as like Jane Fonda workouts, right? It was very much like the boom came later, and it was, I think, very unexpected. And it really did change some of the way those standards were applied. And the context of which like teacher training programs were happening also shifted, I think, with the industry growth.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of those folks that were there at the beginning of Yoga Alliance, and like you said, were concerned with the therapeutic application of yoga. Like a lot of why I know those names is because I am a CIYT. Like, so I'm very involved in the International Association of Yoga Therapists.
Which has its own standards and certification system, which are different and more kind of advanced, right? Or more...
it seems like they just a lot of those people went from one institution to the next institution, which is useful, but there's this weird middle ground now where some of us, you know, like I've been in industry since 2000, essentially 2003. Like some of us have a staggering amount of training and standards, and other people are like, okay, so I now can go online and do my vinyasa practice, and it's completely asynchronous learning. And there's like, okay, do we have to reframe our standards? Because these 200 hours, like 200 hours where you're watching videos versus 200 hours where you're like coming to a studio and you're getting one-on-one instruction with a teacher who has then had teachers who've had teachers, like that's a different thing. How do we deal with that? Because it's not modern. Now, what happened then isn't translating well. You know what I mean? It's like a bad joke, like a bad out of taste joke from the 80s.
No, and I think it goes back to kind of like this question of like why 200 hours in the first place, right? Because
Yes.
it's definitely adapted and changed with the online environment now, and we are seeing, right, the shift towards online teaching. And I think YA actually just like approved
Yes, they
all
did.
online, right, yoga
Yes, they
teacher
did.
training, which is a big shift, a big deal. I did not get enough discussion, I think, in the yoga scene, in my opinion, but that's just me. And I do teach online for sociology, not for yoga,
Yeah.
but like I understand the online environment, but and there's some benefits there, but it's a lot more messy. And I think it, again, goes back to like this 200-hour model in the first place, right? And when you look at the actual 200-hour and 500-hour model, right? One of the interesting things about it is that it's very vague. It's not actually based on like the quality of instruction. It's really about the quantity of instruction, right? So the whole model is based on um, the number of hours that you're supposed to work on in some way, shape, or form, like particular topics tied to yoga, whether that's postures or anatomy or physiology or whatever, right? And they have the breakdown of like you do this many hours of this thing and this many hours of this other part of the practice and so on and so forth. And this was like an intentional framing by the creators of it, in large part because they had so much conflict trying to figure out how to create certification standards, right? So if we look at like IYT, right, the International Association of Yoga Therapists, or even like the British Wheel of Yoga or the European Yoga Union, right? All of these ones took years to develop. Like they had a process of like developing those standards that really was like much more in depth. There was literal years involved. And with YA, what you see is like the entire process from like just beginning to talk about it in a serious way to like creating the standards and forming YA and like starting the registry was like 16 months. And even though they had this goal of having a lot of people involved in the process, because of just the nature of like how it unfolded and how quickly it went and how much conflict and difficulty there was, like it quickly narrowed to basically just about like 10 people involved. So it's supposed to be a lot more, ended up being roughly around like 10 folks or so from different traditions and lineages and things like that, but almost all postural traditions and lineages, like not much outside of that. A lot of the therapy folks had by this point kind of jumped ship for IYT.
Yep.
And that's why IYT, right, is much more, I think, rigorous, right, in terms of their training. And so because they had so much disagreement, right, what they ended up doing was they couldn't agree on like learning objectives based on quality, about like you have to know these things, right, in order to be a teacher trainer or like a teacher and go through a teacher training or offer one. They instead just went with hours. You need to study for this many hours, right? And it's a very different model than some other models we see. And it's also, unfortunately, really common when we see professionalization, like processes happen, whatever the profession, where the very nature of that process of trying to create like standards ends up leading you to develop the most minimal standards that everyone can possibly agree on. And it's exactly what we see with so they ended up like really focusing on this one question that Kamenov like talks about in some of his interviews about this, where he says like the main question they really focused on was, what do we think the minimum number of number of hours, right, that someone is going to need to teach a class without hurting someone. And that was it. That was like, it wasn't like, what do folks need to know to understand yoga and be like a really great teacher? It was like minimum number of hours to not hurt your student. Which, as you can imagine, led to these very, very low level standards.
Quick break to tell you about The Backroom, my Patreon community for yoga and wellness professionals. Here's what it actually is. Every week you get a focus prompt, reflection sheets, and a shared working rhythm that you can drop into on your own schedule. There's no live calls, no required check-ins, no one telling you to hustle harder. There's a quarterly book club and access to a growing archive of guides and reflections, all connected to this work that we do on the show. It's built for people who want to think more clearly about their careers without the noise of social media and public discourse. It's $8 a month, and there's a free tier if you want to try it first. Find it at thesunlightexperience.com/thebackroom, and the link is in the show notes.
So they're very vague, right? They don't include learning objectives. They just identify those total hours of study. And then encourage, right, the graduates to register with Yoga Alliance. And it's just a registry. There's no oversight. There's no regulation of it, unlike a lot of other kind of what we might think of as sister professions. And I don't really like combining it, but like things even like massage therapists have a lot
Yes.
more oversight and regulation, right?
Yes.
So the fact that yoga is completely unregulated is a very unusual thing. And it's very much reflecting, right, the backgrounds of the people who were involved, right? Almost everyone who is involved in the creation of YA and the registry standards, they were predominantly white, middle-class American teachers, reflecting, right, the broader demographics of a lot of yoga teachers at the time in the US. And they brought a lot of their own background and kind of their own like understanding of the practice, which was often coming from like a very particular like pastoral tradition, again, for most of these folks. And a lot of the philosophy and the kind of more in-depth study of the yoga traditions, right, that folks were involved in was also the stuff they had the most disagreement about. And so that was often the stuff that got kind of pushed to the side and or minimized the most or vagued up right into these broad categories that you can like literally teach like anything as you within. There's no
It's
like
crazy. It's crazy.
really wild. And so this relates to like the online stuff, right? So if we get back to the present day, they're basing it off a already existing certification standard that's literally just about the number of hours. There's no requirement to be in person with a teacher for a certain amount, right? And it's not part of that standard from the get-go. And because of that, it makes it very easy for YA to just be like online is fine, right? Because there isn't this like model where you have you know, this particular way of training, like that's not specified in the model. So it really does kind of create this opportunity, right, where things like online teaching becomes like very easy to mesh with those requirements and very easy for YA to approve. It's financially a smart move for them, right? Even though it's a horrible move for the industry and the pay of yoga teachers overall, right? It you know, drops the amount of money that yoga teachers make significantly. You see like really ridiculously low cost programs. But for YA, it's financially really great for them because they can suddenly get way more registrants and way more people buying in. And again, it like, you know, boosts their visibility, I think, immensely. So I'm not really surprised they did it, but I was also very concerned. I do think online teaching can be really fantastic. It's in many ways more accessible. People sometimes feel much more comfortable, especially if you don't fit into kind of that like quote unquote standard yoga body that's very stereotypical, like a thin, you know, able-bodied individual. Like if you're someone who's larger bodied, if you're someone with a disability, like online teaching can be much more accessible, much more safe feeling. And that's really lovely, but there is something you miss out on, especially when you're thinking of trying to train teachers and train teachers, again, even just that question they thought of, like, how do you have minimum standards not to hurt people, your students? Like you kind of have to have some oversight, some mentorship, and I would argue some in-person training, ideally. It takes a really very carefully thought out online program to be able to do that effectively and not lose quality of instruction. And I don't know how many of those online programs are doing that. I don't know. But I definitely know that YA is not actually doing oversight, right, of those programs the way that they would need to make sure, right, that there's like high quality online programs being offered.
Can we talk about counterculture for a second? Because I want to reverse to this idea. We're a wholly unregulated industry. It's like a nightmare for us, and that's also like a weirdly unpopular opinion, partially because like in my head, how we came up, especially through the 90s, was through a lot of counterculture spaces. I mean, I remember when I first started practicing, it was like you Frodo trying to find the ring, right? Like you're going through somebody's basement. There's like a cat there that nobody owns, and there's maybe air conditioning, and then you had like a secret knock, and then you go in the back door, and like you had this yoga class, and you shoved your money in a shoebox. Like when you were there, that was what we were doing in the 90s. So there's like this counterculture element, because I look at the industry now and I'm like, oh, if it looked like it did now, then I wouldn't have been there. I signed up because of the counterculture aspect of that, which is great, but also counterculture people are assholes, and I'll just speak for myself. So now we have a wholly unregulated industry because nobody wants to play with the government.
Yes. Yeah, no, and I mean the lack of regulation, I think, is a long-term problem, at least in the United States. And again, it's different in other countries. Right? Other countries do have more regulation of it. The U.S. is, I think, unique, and YA, because it's based in the U.S., right, kind of gets to toe that line where they get to avoid regulation, even when they work in other countries, right, which they've gone global. So yeah, that one is really tricky. I think most yoga teachers were like broadly opposed to regulation. And fun fact, most yoga teachers were actually very opposed to the creation of standards in general, which I think is really interesting. It's one of the things that I think people don't really realize, that like, they actually did a poll back in the day when they were creating the standards because they wanted like reader feedback. And like 60% of the people that were polled like didn't want standards to be created, and did it anyway, right? Which is so telling. But yeah, really interesting stuff. But it was very counterculture at, prior to like the 2000s, prior to the industry really developing, like the late 2000s. And then you ended up with it more mainstream with that turn of the century, in large part because there were a number of celebrities that really kind of started practicing, Madonna being obviously like one of the most prominent ones. And there's some other folks as well, some other people. But Madonna especially, right? When Madonna started doing yoga, we know it's mainstream and it's super popular. And it popularized the practice to the point where it became much more acceptable. And then you also have that development of studio systems that really became that like high class, gym kind of membership style space. And back in the day, even back, in the 80s or 90s, if you had a studio space, it was a little more fringy. It was more like a community center kind of feel often. And they were based more kind of on ashram settings originally. So like the early ones were very much like live-in spaces. It was someone's like house that they just happened to teach yoga, and there was, or whatever it would be. But then slowly over that time, like by the 2000s, you start to see that shift where it became more of that like high class gym membership model, like studio space, fancy with a shop, right, where they had merchandise for sale. Yoga Works being like one of the first examples, I think, of that in Santa Monica, in California. But and again, tied to teacher training programs, because how do you afford to offer, right, a space that's a high class gym membership space on yoga, right? We're not talking about like an actual gym where maybe there's more appeal, right? How do you do that with yoga? You offer teacher training programs to fund it. And so that's where you start to see that with the rise of the industry, a lot of these more like kind of fancy yoga studios that started happening. In order to fund rent, they can't just do group classes. You also have to offer things like teacher training programs, and you charge people a lot more for it. And that's where you start to see that the kind of tossed around idea of like yoga teachers as kind of the bread and butter, right, of studios, as a way to kind of turn them out kind of over and over again. You're like producing way more yoga teachers than you actually can afford to pay to actually teach.
It's venture capital. I mean, that's the venture capital model. And that's what happens when, like you said, Yoga Works, Core Power, Moto Yoga, all Yoga Six
examples now.
The
studios are often like the most prominent. And I do think with the online sites, we've seen a shift like post-COVID, right? One of the, for better and worse, right, things that we've seen is that like, unless you're a really big studio system, it's really hard to afford a studio space now. So we're seeing a lot more studios closing, small time studios closing. We're seeing a lot more shift to online offerings. We're seeing a bigger shift to like online schools that then just do like you travel to a space and you rent out, let's say, a room somewhere at a community center, and you like the people who are in that area flock to you, and you're just there for a week and then you go somewhere else, right? So it's a very different model of teaching, I think, now than even like pre-COVID, because just the affordability of like being able to rent space is so much harder for a lot of yoga folks, and getting people out to actually go to classes is harder as a teacher. So the model of teaching has also shifted. And I think that's why we're seeing YA adapt. I don't think they can walk back the 200-hour certification. And this is where they're stuck, right? Because it's like their whole premise is based on the 200, 500-hour certification program and the registry idea, and they're very opposed to regulation. And they will put money towards that front of opposing regulation and like fighting that in court if they have to. And so if you're committed to those things, like how can you change it? Like you're kind of, you're locked in to some degree. And so they're fully committed on that front. I mean, I know there's been conversation out there in the industry before about maybe upping like shifting to 500-hour being the minimum, right? There has been some conversation from some folks, not YA, but like teachers who like propose this, right, as like a solution, quote unquote. But I don't see YA doing it, because most of the people that are paying, right, to be a part of that registry are 200-hour teachers. And if they walked back, right, the 200-hour, it would just be an uproar. I mean, like, people would rebel, they would lose a lot of memberships and registrants, and then they would lose a lot of money, right?
I don't think we get paid enough either to walk back the 200. That's one of the issues I see, is like, we're in this rock and hard space, because 200 hours, I think, honestly, if you're going to teach yoga at a gym, 200 hours is enough. You're fine. It will be fun. This job's not that hard, you guys. Like,
yeah, if you're teaching group classes, right? If you're only teaching
group
posture,
classes,
right?
at a gym or a fitness facility, so you can get your free gym membership at Planet Fitness. You're going to go there. You're going to teach yoga class. 200 hours is fine. You guys are fine. But then once you come into a space where you're offering more, like, then the question becomes, are the people who are doing 200 hours and teaching at Planet Fitness doing the same job that people who are 500 hours, 1,000 hours, who've spent, decades training? Like, we all have the same job. Everybody thinks of us the same, but unlike a dentist, where you just start out as a dentist, you're cleaning teeth, you're 20 years in as a dentist, you're cleaning teeth. Like, this is very different what happens. And that, because, like, I want the Y to give us a designation about us, those of us who've been in industry for a long time, versus like somebody who's qualified to teach yoga movement safely at a gym.
Yeah. Teach your students minimum standards without hurting them, right? That key question. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I do think I personally don't like YA, just as a personal practitioner. I think there's been a big movement to boycott them, which I think is worth mentioning. And I think it's lovely to see folks like really moving away from the YA model and saying it's like not worth it, right? So I do think that's one route like people can go, is like just say like, I'm not even going to engage with YA. I don't subscribe to YA, right? I don't register with them, but here's what I offer. And I'm going to explain to you like why it's different and why it's more rigorous, right? Obviously, there's other alternatives like the International Association of Yoga Therapists, right? So IYT, which has a much more rigorous certification standard, but is also more rigorous because they work in medical contexts and they need that liability protection, right? And all that kind of stuff that comes with that. So if you want to do the kind of more therapy, wellness, health, like, medical side of things, like IYT is a better option for yoga teachers anyway, I think, because it does protect you a little more and it gives you more ins with the medical industry. But I do think there's this odd middle ground of like, if you actually want to teach yoga, like the holistic element of yoga, like yoga as it originally was taught as a practice for liberation, right? As a practice for self-realization, God realization, whatever you want to talk about it as. There's a lot of different words that are used. Process for enlightenment. Like, that's a very different thing than teaching postural group classes in a fitness setting. And like, that is really tricky because like at that point, like you're not even going to fit with how people even see a yoga teacher, right? When people think yoga teacher, they think a fitness instructor, at least in the mainstream side of things, right? And so it's like, how do you distinguish yourself in those ways? And I think that's where it gets into that gray area of like, YA is, it's acceptable for what most pop culture folks view yoga teachers as, which again is like this like group fitness instructor class that only teaches postures. It's basically just like a fitness class that they call yoga in a very appropriative, often very problematic way. But it's okay for that. And I don't see it changing. I think what we'll likely see shift is maybe the development of some additional certification standards, right? Obviously, YA has moved on and they've got the 500-hour like experienced, right, yoga teacher, right? That like next level standard. And they do have more, stringent guidelines about, for example, like who can actually teach a teacher training program. Back in the day, it was like, if you got a 200-hour, you could teach a 200-hour, which has changed, right? So there's like some more high level standards, like you have to have more experience to teach a teacher training program now, which I think is good. But I do think we're starting to see that element where we're starting to see additional certifications kind of stacked. So like if you want to teach prenatal, now that's its own certification, right? If you and then it adds, right, there's all these other ones. And I think it's possible we'll see that with some of the more philosophical practices. I still think that's somewhat unlikely. I think we'll probably see more of a revitalization of particular traditions where people actually just go through that like traditional mode of teaching if they want to, let's say, do more philosophical teaching. But you have to kind of know what you're getting into as a student and also as a teacher in those cases. And that's where it gets, I think, a little extra muddy sometimes.
Can we talk about the scope of the Yoga Alliance for a second? Because I have to say that is for me. And hi, Yoga Alliance. You look nice today. I hope your breakfast was great. Your shoes, amazing. I'm so glad they were such a good deal. Okay. So, like, the Yoga Alliance can't possibly ethically represent all the groups that they claim to represent because they hold our standards, which means they hold our industry. And in the US, they're a trade organization too, which means they're also lobbying our government. Like, that's a problem. And they hold our standards, but they also claim to represent the teachers, and they also claim to represent the studios, and they also claim to represent the trainers. All of those groups have different objectives. And how is it possible that one organization feels like they can represent each of those? Like, the best practices of a studio are often at odds with the best practices of a teacher and the best practices of a training program. How are you, like, what the
I don't
fuck?
know how they can. I mean, realistically, it's pretty much impossible, right? And I think
Yes.
the only reason they are doing that right now is because there's no alternative, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those issues with the industry and just how it happened. With there's no regulation at the state level, right? And again, YA is super opposed to that for a number of reasons. In part because of this issue of like yoga itself is so diverse. There's so many different ways to teach, so many different traditions, right? What does it even mean? If you're sitting learning meditation, that's yoga. If you're sitting and doing, or you're not sitting, if you're doing postures, right, it's yoga, right? So like, how do you regulate, quote unquote, an industry at the state level? That's the reason why they resist it. One of the big ones. But yeah, YA, right, represents like this huge range of people in the industry, ranging from like students all the way up to like, studio owners, right?
Yes.
Whatever it might be, teacher training folks. And I think it's just the way in which it happened, where like they're really like the only point of contact and hub for representation. I think that's a very problematic thing. Like, we did used to have some more active yoga teacher associations, right? CETA being obviously one of the most prominent ones, the California Yoga Teachers Association. But with the development of the industry, like a lot of those have lost a lot of power and a lot of visibility. Like they still exist, right? Different yoga teacher associations, like professional associations, but they're just so much less powerful. They're much smaller, right? We have like some new ones like the Black Yoga Teachers Association that started a while ago, which is awesome. But again, small, right? They don't have as much power. YA, just because of the nature of when it happened and how big it's grown with the industry and how many people are registered, like they have a lot of money, they got a lot of power, and they use it. And they're like the only hub. So, I mean, I would love to see some alternatives. Obviously, there's some alternative programs like IAYT, right? That's more international for therapy, but it's we don't really have like yoga teacher professional associations. We don't have a union, which I think, again, unionization of yoga teachers is huge challenge, but I also think is a really interesting direction. And we've seen some of the bigger chain studios have unionization efforts like happen within their chain studio system. So it's definitely a conversation that's been going on, especially in recent years with the revitalization and interest in unionization. But like those types of things, like how do you get unionization of teachers? How do you get like groups in the industry, like studio owners, let's say, to like organize together? It's hard. Like, a lot of people are really siloed and isolated into their own like little worlds. The rise of the internet and social media helps, but it's a really just like hard organizing thing to do. And so inevitably YA is like kind of the only one left to kind of take on that role. And they are trying to, and they've been trying to do it with as much grace as they can, but it is a hard thing to do. And I do, again, find YA very problematic for a lot of reasons. I think, they might try their best, but it's just limited. It's limited in what you can actually do with that structure and without oversight.
And they do fight organizations that have come on the scene to try. So it's not like if somebody would only start an organization, they would be like, well, here, we won't deal with the teachers anymore. Like, that's not how they have.
They want, because they would lose funding, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
they have financial incentive as much as they're technically supposed to not be for profit, right? It's they do have financial incentive to like protect their jurisdiction, right? And they do that. And IYT is an exception, right? In large part because it existed before Yoga Alliance happened.
Yeah.
And some of the people who created Yoga Alliance were also involved in IYT, right?
Yeah.
So there was some crossover. And so I think, and they have like different jurisdictions, right? IYT is like the therapy side of things, whereas, YA tries to be like the umbrella that catches everyone else. So I think they coexist a little better, but yeah, they are very protective of what they seem or see as their space, right? Or their, I don't think they would call them their customers, but basically, right? Their customers, the people who register for them and fund them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's the biggest challenge. Can we talk about unionization for a second? Because the UK is unionized. Like, their teachers launched a union, and I'm curious, like, there are different challenges that we have here in the States, partially being the Yoga Alliance is our official legal trade union, right? So they represent us, which I keep telling everybody means we can sue them. Just in case you were wondering, we could sue them collectively. But like, is it possible for us to even unionize? Because so my studio in my town holds employees. I think we're the only one still with like 7 of us here. I'm the only person that has employees versus contractors. Unless we're like gonna contact SAG-AFTRA and be like, how did you unionize a bunch of actors who don't have jobs? Like how do we do that?
Yeah, I think there's more structure in places like the UK, and again, like more regulation and stuff too, right? So it's some ways it's a little easier in other countries to try and unionize. The US is really tricky for a number of reasons. One, the industry, I think, in the US is more fractured. There's more just independent teachers doing their own thing. There's more independent studios that are, again, like very isolated from other studio systems, especially across state lines. And then you add in the fact that state rules around unionization are different in different states. And some states are really anti-union and other states are easier, but still hard. So it's extra challenging in the US for especially those reasons, right? Legally, you'd have to navigate like a whole bunch of really tricky legal questions if you were trying to do it at a national level, let alone logistical, right? Things of just like, how do you get all yoga teachers on board? And that's why it's easier, right? Within like chain studio systems or something like that, like you're unionizing within your company, right? Which is partly why it's easier because you're located within like a particular geographic region. You all have contacts, you're all teachers in the same organization, right? But with that said, there's fewer of those around than people like to think, and they've also a number of them have gone bankrupt and like have folded. So, so I mean, it's gonna make that, I think, extra challenging in the U.S. context. I still think it's a wonderful like thing to work towards and a wonderful goal in mind. I don't know how realistic it's gonna be, at least at the national level in the U.S. And I do think sometimes the idea of maybe a professional association is, I think, a much, first off, easier goal to start with. And also for a number of reasons, logistically, it's easier, right? There's less legal stipulations around it versus unionization, which is a very specific legal thing. And then there's also like this element of like it doesn't step on the toes of YA as much because YA is technically like a registry, right? It's not actually like a professional association, and so you can kind of get around it that way. And I think if folks wanted to go that route, it's an easier way to make connections and build the network you would need to even start the process of unionizing. But without like that network from the get-go, unless you got YA on board with it, which like is never going to happen.
Right.
Like YA would be a great network to start with, but like there's no way, right? So you'd have to like build out the network first. So something like a professional association, it's more appealing, but then you have to get folks on board with like, how do you get people to be willing to pay dues? And that's the like challenging question, especially when there's like separate siloed professional associations in different regions or for different folks, like let's say the Black Yoga Teachers Association. And folks have limited money, right? So like, how do you ask yoga teachers who are also, for many of them, already struggling? Not everyone is, but a vast majority of yoga teachers don't make a lot. like, how do you ask them to like cough up money every year for a professional association that's going to take years to really like build out to get to the point where you can even unionize or pursue a lawsuit or like whatever you want to do for organizing work? And that's challenging. It's not impossible, but it is more challenging. And you'd really need like a dedicated core group of people who are willing to put in a lot of time and energy for it. And finding folks who are willing to do that and have the financial capital to do that is really hard.
So this is the same sort of problem with the standardization of teacher training too, because like, so let's say we all decide that 500 should be our baseline versus 200 hours, right? But a 500-hour training costs so much more than a 200-hour training. And if you're still going to graduate from that and make $20 a class or $30 a class, then I mean, that's the problem, right? Like, so do we make more money by increasing standards, or do we start by trying to make more money so that we can increase standards? Like, answer that question, chicken or the egg?
I don't know if we can. I don't think you can. I think it's that cyclical chicken and egg problem, right? And I think it's a reflective problem in the industry as a whole of just like the yoga industry itself is like really toxic and very problematic, right? And I think it's driven by a number of factors, and capitalism obviously is like the underlying structure there, right? When you have yoga teacher trainings and yoga teaching, like, how do I want to say this? Like, reliant on capitalism.
Yeah.
That's like an inherent paradox from the get-go, I would argue. And so like, for example, like there's a lot of talk of like, how do you decolonize the practice, right? The practice has been very deeply colonized in so many different ways over the last like couple hundred years. And like, this is always a sticking point with these topics is like, I don't know if you can actually decolonize yoga without opposing capitalism.
Yeah.
And that by nature means opposing the industry. But then that becomes really problematic because it's really hard to find a way to teach and retain like the tradition and knowledge of yoga across generations without some sort of financial support for teachers, right? So like, how do you still afford food and like a living wage and have a house, to live in or a roof over your head as a teacher, even if you're dedicated to like teaching in a way that really honors the traditions and tries to pass those down to future generations? And I don't know if it can fully be done in the industry as we have it now. I think it's just an inherently exploitative industry, right? We're relying on yoga teacher training programs to fund teachers, right? To pay for the roof over the head and the food, right? Because that's the system we have. Is like you make the most money training other teachers because they're willing to pay more. But then you end up creating way more teachers than you can possibly have, right, in the professional space. And so it ends up lowering, right, the amount of money that everyone can kind of make. And it also, as we know, the standards are really low, right? So the general knowledge and understanding of yoga also goes down over time, right? Where you have a lot of these teachers who really just don't know a lot about the practice, but they're technically certified. But like I've encountered teachers before who like probably wouldn't even agree that like yoga and meditation are the same, which I think is really interesting, right? So they don't understand, right, kind of the roots of yoga or a holistic view of yoga. Like they just see it as postures because that's what they learned in their teacher training program. So it's very problematic. It's a chicken and egg problem, right? I think it's going to require us to prioritize a deeper understanding of the practice and really like honor a deeper understanding of the practice as more than just posture and more than just the group fitness classes, right? If you think of yoga as something deeper than that, it requires you to have deeper knowledge of it and also necessitates that you honor like your teacher that knows a lot more than you as a student. And I think that's where it's tricky, right? Because it also means the students have to like have a better relationship with their teachers. And that ultimately means rooting and building out community. And I think that's where I've seen the most radical teaching and the most radical, addressing of this issue, right? Of like, how do you work around these systems? How do you earn a living right? As a teacher?
Right.
It's so hard. The people who are doing it like really well are people who are thinking outside the box. They're not just doing studios and group fitness classes and yoga teacher trainings anymore. Like the teachers who are really branching out and being like, I'm going to teach philosophy classes to small groups and I'm going to do it through Zoom because that's like it works for that type of thing through Zoom. Like you can teach philosophy a little easier through like online or something versus like the teachers who are doing, I'm going to do like individual, right, one-on-one therapy style or just like individual, right, practice and training, you can afford, to have a higher pay, right? Ask for higher pay sometimes, right? Depending on the person. But like if you work out with privates and you do, this kind of different style of teaching, let's say with philosophy, or you, work that system of like the online to your advantage, where you have the following that's more a student base that actually wants to learn and respects you as a teacher and really appreciates your work, then you can travel right to different places and offer different things and people will come to you. You don't have to have the space you're renting, right, and paying big overhead costs for. So like really being flexible with that, it's going to take a lot of really creative navigation, I think, as teachers to really navigate that successfully. And it's extra hard to do in an environment where we're getting, teacher training programs all online for like $99, which I've seen ads. It's
Crazy.
crazy.
Yeah.
So I think it really takes educating students also too, right? Like what are we even offering as teachers? You need to have students who are willing to find a good teacher and pay some money for it, with the understanding that you're not just paying for like the class, you're paying for that teacher's like training and in-depth connection to the practice and their ability to like sustain life while they do that, for dental and like, all these other things like groceries and the roof of your head and all that stuff that we need. So
Well, I mean, this is the same question as the studio system because I mean, I know you were back on the internet when I was there too, where everybody was like, "Oh my God, we got to get rid of the studio system." And now I'm 5 years in as an owner. I'll be 4 years. I'll be 5 years, or 4 months. I'll be 5 years in. Like we can't get rid of the studio system. Like I'm sorry to tell you guys, but our market, from like I'll use business terms, but like our market understands that yoga exists in yoga studios.
and it has always had a physical presence, right? Yoga historically, has always been taught in physical spaces. And it doesn't always it's not always called a studio, right? But ashram settings, right? We can think about community centers, right? Back in the day, especially in the 60s. And I think that's wonderful. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of that model. I think the model of what we think of as a studio has to change. We have to shift more towards the counterculture understanding of it, away from the like commercial gym understanding towards like a more community space. Because if it's a community space, people will show up and people want to show up and they want to spend time there. They know people, there's connection, there's relationship, there's more than just like the physical side of offerings, right? There's workshops and there's in-depth training and there's, offerings beyond just postures. There's learning philosophy. There's, all these other things that you can incorporate meditation, right? And when you offer like those things in that community model space, like it becomes so much more rich and you get such a more deep, holistic understanding of the practice. And I do think it creates a much more sustainable community, right? Financially for the teacher and also for the student as like a sustainable space to learn and grow as a practitioner across time, which is often lacking, right, in the gym context setting of studio spaces. So I think if like we can come back to that, I think we're going to be okay. And I also think we have to think about like offering yoga if we shift away from this fancy studio, right, commercial gym model, like you have to be willing to like rent spaces that maybe are not in the best neighborhoods and or maybe not in areas like urban centers, like rural areas, these types of things. It's especially when folks can travel for things, we have to be more willing to be flexible. And I think in the past, and like the height of the industry, right, it was the fancy studio space in the most wealthy neighborhood, and like that was kind of the model. And obviously definitely some concerns around that, right? You have to think about things like gentrification and being a force of gentrification if you're a yoga studio entering into a space that's a place where you can actually afford, but then also then potentially pushes other people out. But I do think, again, if you're approaching it from the community model, you're actually engaging with the actual communities you're in. There's really radical work that you can do there, and you can really, you can teach in a way that really has huge impacts, not just for the teacher, right, feeling like they're actually supported and able to afford food, but also for like, the community to actually get something out of it and have it be a resource and a community center, right, for spiritual learning and growth. And I think that's really beautiful. So I don't know if that's a nice framework, but that's my take on it.
You've literally described how I lasted through COVID. I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm like, I make a lot of money running a book club, you guys. like ridiculous amount of money for, you know what, like 6 hours in total of work that I do. My book club sells out every time. We do a little bit of asana, we do a little bit of meditation, but you know what? Like people just make friends. That's and then they all come back. And they come back every single time and they bring their friends. And then we talk about like all the books that we want to talk about that, you know, you read a book and you're like, oh my God, I'm desperate to talk about. We did the Testaments and Janet Margaret Atwood's The Testaments, you know, like those things. I mean, that's the space that people want to come to. And from a business perspective, like if you're a studio owner, I'm going to tell you my retention rate is so much better than yours. The end, like crazy better. I run the stats like
because you have real community. And I think that's the challenge. And like actually doing that work, like it takes being invested in your community to do. And unfortunately, right, you know, that's not always the case with a lot of studio owners, especially when we get into like the chain studio owners, right? Because if you're thinking about like, you know, people who run a lot of chain studios, they're often like business-minded people. They just want to make money. And that's a different thing. Like obviously we want to make money so that you all can eat and have roofs over your head. Like all those things, right? Fair living wage, super important. But like if your goal is just profit off of yoga and the studios, like you're gonna have struggling. You're gonna have that struggle of like retaining students, getting folks through the door, especially in the modern age when there's so many more low-cost options and streaming sites and all this kind of stuff. Right. The goal is the community element. And I think that's the root of like yoga. When we think about how yoga was traditionally taught, like way back before you know, it came to the US. When we think of like indigenous knowledge traditions and indigenous education systems, what are called indigenous education systems in a lot of like Native American studies work, like they're rooted in community and they're also like a cyclical, like long-term lifelong process, right? You learned yoga with a guru or multiple teachers, right? However many folks you studied with. And you would learn it in the course of like one-on-one teaching, but also community teaching. You would have a community of other spiritual seekers and other knowledge seekers that you would be talking with and learning with and having discussions with and studying texts and doing asana practice and having meditation practice. And you would have that across the course of your life, right? It wasn't something that you just took a 1 month intensive and then you're like done and be like, oh, I'm good, I'm enlightened. Like, no, that's not how it works. You had to like actually engage with that community for a long time. And because people lived in these areas that they were studying and like you had a long-term relationship with your teachers and the other students. And I think going back towards that model, it's going to look different now because there's, you know, the world changes, right? There's different contexts, different geographical contexts, different cultural contexts. But if we can get that root of it, like back into our teaching, that's where like that true connection happens. It's also where the true growth happens. And it's also where that true sustainable like teaching can happen, both for the teacher and I think the students.
Okay, so to finish, let's talk like if there's one thing we could do, and one thing, this is such a like clickbaity question, so you can ignore it and answer it however you want, but like what is the thing that we can do that helps improve our training programs? Like what can we improve them?
I mean, I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, at the systems level, I think we really have to. Well, okay. So my question to you is like, are you talking as a teacher or like, are you talking as like a student?
As an industry,
Industry. Okay.
Industry.
I think as someone who's like a teacher in the industry, like we really have to be willing to like hold to our values and not cave. And I think that's really crucial. I think a lot of times what happens is folks just kind of cave to what's easy or what pays you good. And that's a slippery slope. I think we really have to honor the practice. We have to honor our values. And like I was just saying, like build community where you are. Because I don't know if there's a way to effectively fight YA. Like you can boycott them. And I encourage everyone to consider boycotting YA because I don't necessarily think they're worth paying into personally. That's just me. But like wherever you're at, you can build community. You can make sure the teacher training that you're offering, let's say if you're, you know, qualified to do a teacher training program, or you feel like you have something to offer, like have it be reflective of what you actually know. Acknowledge what you don't know, bring people in, right? Build community through collaboration and not exploitation of those teachers, but genuine collaboration of those teachers, right? Which I think is really important. And build out the community of your students, right? And see it not just as like a profession, which I think is really, like, I know we talk about it as a profession. This podcast is about yoga as a profession, right? Yay. But ultimately, like it is a path towards enlightenment. And if we think about it as that and not just as like a way to make money, how we engage changes. And so I do think like a path forward is really just making sure the spaces we're involved in, the programs we're involved in, right? Whatever it is as a teacher, the industry spaces we're in as a teacher, like being that voice of reason to be like, you don't have to just go with the crowd and be like, pay into YA and be like, oh, we're stuck with it. It's fine. Like you can push back and be like, I'm just going to not do YA, or like, even if I pay into it just to have the thing, if I have to, whatever, I'm going to do it my way. And I'm going to offer these things for these reasons. And I'm going to explain them adequately so students really understand where I'm coming from and actually get like the benefits and again, build out that community. So it's long-term and it's sustainable. And I think if we can do that, our teaching can really benefit and also become more sustainable long-term, regardless of what happens with the industry. You don't need to buy the fancy pair of yoga pants to learn yoga. You can just pay a really good teacher and sit together in a circle and like do your thing and like get a lot more out of it than if you buy all the products from all the fancy companies and show up in a fancy studio to take a 1 hour class of postures. It's that's really lovely too, and it will get you fit, right? And that's cool, I guess. But it's not all there is. And I think getting to that depth, right? If you only stay on the shallow level, it's cool, you'll get stuff from it, but it'll be these kind of shallow gains. To get the really deep gains, we really have to go deeper, both as an industry and also as a community of practitioners. Mm-hmm.
Amara, can you tell people where to find you if they want to read about what you're researching or writing about?
Yes, I do have a Facebook page. It's not super active these days, but you can find me there. I think my handle is something like Amara Miller Yoga or something like that. And then I do also have a website. So if you check out my website, it has links to like my socials. And I also have a link to my blog, which might be more of interest to some folks than maybe the social media accounts. And I can, hold on, let me pull up my actual website so I can share it with you briefly.
Girl, you have a blog? How am I not reading your blog? I need you to have a Substack. I need you to have a Substack so I can subscribe.
Yeah. But yeah, it's amaralmiller.wixsite.com because I am not paying for a fancy title on my website, and then a /educator is my actual website. So if you look me up, it should pop up.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this chat.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely talking about all this stuff.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Amara. I truly love it. I know I said this last week, but I really do love it when I get to record these conversations that stand the test of time. And for sure, this was one of those. Make sure you tune in July for an updated version of this conversation. Our chat is so good. Now, next week is another revisited conversation, this time with Khalees Sanders. In the beginning of 2025, Khalees and I chatted all about perfectionism in the activism space of the yoga world. And if you're a longtime listener, I am like 110% sure that you have heard me reference this conversation at least once. So I cannot wait for you to listen if you haven't heard it already. Now, let's go get to work, and I will catch you around the water cooler next time.